Chapter 12. Alone in Gutenberg, I had to take up the responsibility of running the estates. In a way, it was a blessing that my days were so filled with work. I had to do my best to try to keep the complicated machinery running. The most difficult thing for me was to visit the authorities, many of them high Nazis in Nuremberg and Munich, who were entirely unsympathetic to my problems. I had to plead to have valuable workers released from military duty. I had to fight for every tractor, every cow and pig, and every can of gasoline. Besides this, it was my duty to visit the people of Gutenberg and the other villagers, to encourage them, to comfort them over the loss of a son or husband, to visit the sick and care for their needs. I tried to take Enoch's place wherever I could. I tried to talk with and encourage our good and faithful farmers the way Enoch himself would have talked to them. I was astonished to find myself saying things in the very phrases and words that Enoch would have used, his own individual mode of expression. It was uncanny, as if he were speaking through me. There was certainly a spiritual participation between us in this work. My life hinged on news from the front. My dreams at night took me to the distant places where my loved ones were so close to death. Letters arrived from the boys who were fighting in Poland. They told of death and bravery and revealed the impact of the ghastly happenings on their minds and hearts. It took 3 weeks for a letter to reach me, and in 3 weeks so much could happen. I had the great consolation of daily Mass in our chapel, the sustaining comfort of the Blessed Sacrament under our own roof, a safe and sure refuge. After my visit with Bishop White's to see Therese Neumann, I had returned many times over the years to visit with her. I had gained from her a new and deep understanding of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. I felt the overwhelming reality of the constant continuation of the deed of redemption. Daily Mass was, for me, the close bond between me and my dear ones. It was the source from which I drew the courage to meet all the bewildering problems which kept on arising each day. For counsel and advice, I would go to see Count Berthold Stuyvenberg in Greifenstein. Our friendship had grown with the years. It was a great help to be able to turn to him, to feel encouraged by his kindness and strength. He had grown older in years, but not in appearance. He was active in body and keen of mind. Just as in the old days when Enoch and I had visited him, he would be waiting for me under the arch of the drawbridge, tall, erect, his warm smile of welcome filling my heart with thankfulness that I had such a friend. Christmas 1939. In spite of trials and problems, it stands out as a high place of joy in my memories. It was almost unbelievable that our family was to be together for a reunion in Gutenberg. The snow-covered house was to embrace Enoch and the boys, all of us for a few short weeks. The rooms, so silent and empty with them away, would echo again with laughter. Every hour would be filled to overflowing with happiness. Enoch's own special joy in decorating the Christmas tree himself he shared this year with the boys. In the Hall of Arms, as always, we made a ceremony of it. Each bright bauble and glowing candle was placed carefully on the fragrant green branches. Silent night, holy night. Our voices were raised in the sweet hymn which we so dearly loved. This year, Christmas Eve was more beautiful than ever, with us all united around the manger and the sleeping Christ child. I felt as if I were in a dream. Enoch, Philip Franz, Karl Theodor, Nives, and Teresa. I embraced them all with my love. Every minute was a mixture of joy and anguish, knowing that all too soon war would take my dear ones away. I tried to hide my tears, and I saw Enoch, so handsome in a new navy uniform, trying to hide from me the tears in his own eyes. He knew, as he always did, what was in my heart, sharing my intense happiness and my sorrow, sensing my foreboding, trying to banish the feeling that this Christmas might, for some of us, be the last. As a Christmas gift for Enoch, I had made a golden chasuble for use in the chapel. There was so little that I could give to Enoch which he did not already possess. But this gift, as well as others which I had made myself, pleased him deeply, and he had a rare way of expressing his pleasure and gratitude. He said that this gift was the best that I had ever given to him. I had used the ancient Gothic technique of applying figures on the vestment. It was aptly with the 6 figures of our patron saints: Saint George killing the dragon, for Enoch; Saint Elizabeth with her arms filled with roses, for myself; Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Charles, for the boys; Our Lady and Saint Teresa, for the girls. The figures of the saints were standing in the branches of a vine. A little replica of Gutenberg Castle on its rocks was hidden in its roots, the vine itself twining around a centre emblem of the coronation of Our Lady. In having our patron saints under the emblem of Our Lady, I felt that I was placing our entire family under the special protection of the Blessed Virgin. It had taken me a very long time to sew the chasuble, many hours in which my love for Enoch had gone into every stitch, my love for Enoch and my love for him whom this gift would honour, him in whom our love had always been so closely bound. The vestment was used for the first time at midnight mass in the chapel. On either side of the altar there were 2 Christmas trees, bright with candles. We sang the Te Deum, each of us trying bravely to praise God and hide our tears. Christmas Day we had our annual party for the village children, and then turned on the radio, hoping to hear some Christmas carols. But instead, the air was filled with Gibbos's message to the German people. What a contrast there was in the voice and message of Gibbos and the simple pious speech which we heard broadcast by our England's king. It was like a comforting message from another world, our world. During the holidays, we went hunting in the snow-white woods around the castle. I had never seen Enoch so happy. He was like a young comrade with the boys. There was an entirely new phase in our relationship with Philip Franz and Karl Theodor. We met on new ground. After our days of hunting, it was wonderful to have them with us for long discussions by the fire in the library. We talked about art and literature, and Enoch impressed upon them the importance of tradition and responsibility in which he himself was so steeped. Enoch was eager to share with his sons all the rich knowledge and experience of his own life. We even read poetry aloud and laughed a great deal, and we were unbelievably happy, living for a brief time in a world of make-believe peace. We put from us all problems of war, of politics, and the near heart-rending reality of parting. The inevitable day arrived. I watched from my tower window as the car, carrying those 3 precious persons, wound down the road to the snow-covered valley, carrying them away from me out into the turmoil of war. Now that they were gone, I let flow the tears which seemed to well up from the deep reservoir of my grief shared by mothers and wives all over Europe. All my days, active as they were, seemed to be days of waiting for news from the boys, now fighting in France, waiting for news from Enoch in the north. Months passed, and it was not until late in the summer of 1940 that I had a few days' reunion with Enoch in Flensburg. It is difficult to describe the supreme happiness of those short days. The knowledge that they were to be so brief gave to them an intensity of joy which was almost unbearable. We celebrated my birthday in our tiny hotel room. Enoch came with his arms filled with flowers. Our room was smothered in them. He also brought little things which he thought would please me. A very special gift was a heavy gold link bracelet. There was one for me, and also 2 smaller ones which I was to take back to Teresa and Nivis. As he put mine on my wrist, he said, "I want you, the 3 of you, to wear these always." What could be in his mind that he should make such a request? It was as if he were making a farewell gift to us all. I forced the thought from my mind. Never had I been so aware of the depth of my love for Enoch. It was a trembling happiness, almost a frightening feeling that supreme happiness could be so close to sorrow. Enoch had a surprise for me in the news that he had been made commanding officer of the Europa. It was to be his task to turn the great peacetime liner into a fighting ship. The brief days of my visit in Flensburg seemed to fly. On my return to Gutenberg, a friend and neighbour, Baron Lerchenfeld, who was also Karl Theodor's commanding officer in France, came to see me. "Elizabeth," he said, "there is something serious I must tell you, now that it is all safely over. Karl Theodor's life was in great danger. You know about this SS officer N. He is the usual SS spy placed in our reactionary regiment." "Yes," I replied, "Karl Theodor has told me about N." Strangely enough, the man seems to have been quite decent to the boy. N's friendship always had a motive. Wait until you hear the story. This N, without my knowledge, did a terrible thing in Poland. His troops captured a small town, and the staff occupied the only stone house in the village. Some innocent civilian Poles, mostly Jews, had hidden in the cellar of this house. Our officers were having dinner when N commanded his orderly, "Here, take my bayonet, go down into the cellar and butcher those Polish pigs." You know Karl Theodor's temper. Well, in a rage he said things that proved his youthful courage, but which were most imprudent. He called N an SS swine. He even said something derogatory about the Führer. N brought Karl Theodor before a court-martial. It is a miracle that N did not shoot him on the spot. Thank God, the judge presiding at the court-martial was by chance one of the few decent men we have in his position in the army. After hours of examination at the trial, Karl Theodor was put under arrest. This means that he will have to wait another half-year before he can receive his commission. But that is all that happened. I was trembling and speechless with the thought of what might have happened. You can be proud of your son's courage, but in God's name tell him to be more prudent in the future. It was, I felt sure, a miracle that Karl Theodor had not been shot by the Gestapo man. My heart cried out, "God bless you, Karl Theodor, for your courage." November 1940 brought good news. The boys, as well as Enoch, sent word that they would again be home for Christmas. All of us had treasured the memories of our happiness of the previous year. Now we all made great plans to fill each day, every moment that we were together, with happiness. Enoch, through our secret means of communication, let me know that he was moving heaven and earth to be transferred to naval headquarters in Berlin. Berlin was now the centre of the anti-Nazi underground activities, and he wished desperately to be, at last, a part of it. Some serious problems arose in regard to the farms, and I decided to go to Greifenstein to talk to Berthold Stauffenberg. This time I remained for several days, as Elizabeth was there with Clemens. He had been suffering with a heart condition and had gone to his father's home in Greifenstein to rest and to escape the strain of his own serious problems in running his farms at Jettingen. Elizabeth did not seem to grow older. She still retained her beauty and that indefinable grace and charm which endeared her to everyone. Our hearts were very close, for she knew and understood me, and we shared all our joys and our sorrows. Each time we met, it was a cherished experience for me. After the household had retired, we spent long hours talking our hearts out. Her son, Karl Berthold, was fighting in Russia. My mother-in-law had spent much time with Elizabeth in Jettingen since Karl Ludwig's marriage, dividing her time between Jettingen, the home in Würzburg, and a chalet which she had in the Bavarian Alps. Elizabeth knew and sympathized with my struggle to find some way to the stubborn heart of the Dowager Baroness. In Greifenstein there was an elderly woman who was there to give muscular massage to Clemens Stauffenberg. This woman was known to possess extraordinary powers of clairvoyance. One morning during my visit she came to my room in great excitement. "Oh, Baroness," she cried, "I've had a most wonderful vision about you. I saw you and all your family united on a day filled with a bright spiritual light. It will soon come on the shortest day of the year. That is quite soon, the 21st of December. The face of the little old woman was filled with joy in telling me about this great day, but I did not give any credence to her prophecies. That morning I returned to Gutenberg and found that Enoch had been trying to reach me by telephone. Finally the call came through. "Here I am in Wurzburg, darling. Come at once. I have great news for you." A few hours later I rushed up the steps of our Wurzburg home into his arms. Never was a meeting so poignant. We were like young lovers meeting after a long separation. When I could speak, I gasped, "How fine you look!" Enoch was radiant. He looked so young, so handsome. "What is that strange odour in your uniform?" I asked. "Oh," he laughed, "I wasn't going to tell you. It must be from my little bomb. I was nearly killed a few days ago. A British bomb hit my Europa. It was inevitable. She sat like the proverbial duck on a pond in Bremerhaven, and of course the British were bound to find her. But as you see, for me everything has turned out all right, though it is strange that I can't get rid of that peculiar odour. It seemed to be just an ordinary bomb. I went into the damaged compartment immediately after the bomb struck. I do remember that the room was filled with heavy fumes. What is strange, too, is the fact that my feet have swollen. I nearly had to face you in slippers." "What is your great news?" I asked breathlessly. "I have succeeded at last. I have been transferred to Naval Headquarters in Berlin. It took a lot of string pulling, for I am one of the Nazis' blackest sheep. Berlin will be the field of the real fight for me. Oh, Elizabeth, at last I'm to have a first-hand encounter with the dragon." I knew that for a moment there would be safety, but what of the future? Soon it could mean terrible danger. The whole of the Nazi machine was honeycombed with Gestapo spies, well-trained and ruthless, but Enoch was eager and excited, happier than I had seen him in years. "My darling, it will be the greatest ride I have taken, and the greatest for which you must hold the stirrup. I feel as if an immense weight were gone from my soul. Here is my chance to be active again, to take up the fight against evil at its source, to be instrumental in freeing my country from the slavery of Nazism." As we settled down to a few days of quiet happiness in Wurzburg, he was filled with plans. "After Christmas we shall go to Berlin together. We shall try to find an apartment, and you shall stay with me, darling." No partings any more? No partings. Every day was filled with joy and excitement. We bought Christmas gifts for each other and for the children, for everyone in the house in Gutenberg. As usual, we had great fun in selecting the gifts for the village children's party. It seemed as if all the anxiety and anguish of years had also been lifted from me. But when we reached Gutenberg, Enoch did not enjoy himself as he usually did. His feet were still swollen, and as the days passed, it became painful for him to walk. "What is the matter, Enoch, dearest?" I asked anxiously. "Don't worry about me," he tried to reassure me. "Whatever it is, it will soon pass." The gamekeepers found fox tracks in the fresh snow and brought the news in great excitement. They knew how Enoch loved to hunt fox. I noticed that he forced himself to go. Even the 2 foxes which he bagged could not raise his spirits. The next morning he could not get out of bed, and he was deadly pale. "I feel very ill, dear," he admitted reluctantly. "Get a doctor." A doctor arrived, looked at him, and announced that he must be taken to a military hospital. The nearest was the Luitpold Hospital in Wurzburg. After waiting long hours, I managed to get a room for Enoch. He fell exhausted into the bed. The drive from Gutenberg had been too much for him. It was past midnight when the head doctor finally came to the room to examine Enoch. He could find nothing wrong. The next morning there was another examination. In the hall, the doctor said, "Don't worry, Baroness, it is nothing serious. Your husband is just overworked and tired. The swelling of the feet is nothing to be alarmed about." I shook my head. "Doctor, I think that my husband is a very sick man." The doctor did not agree with me. I obtained permission to stay with Enoch, and I never left his side day or night. I was there when he was given injections, far too many of them. I could not find out what they were or why they were being given. I tried to protest, but my protests were ignored. Day by day I could see Enoch growing worse, wasting again. Again I talked with the doctor, but he was reluctant to admit any grounds for my fears. Finally, Enoch's physical suffering became almost unbearable. Those days brought us an intense union of love, such as is rarely experienced in this life. Enoch patiently endured his suffering, my trembling heart sharing every pang of his agony. He did not realize his danger, but I did. I felt with terrifying clarity that he, the one I so dearly loved, was on his way to death. The morning of December 20th, the chief doctor asked to see me alone. "I'm sorry to have to tell you, Baroness, there is no hope for your husband. It will be a matter of a few days at most. He is dying of poisoning, undoubtedly from inhaling the fumes of the bomb about which he told us." Enoch always insisted that the British bomb which struck his ship was not a gas bomb. I went slowly back into the sick room. I had to tell Enoch, for he had the right to know. God help me. I sat down beside the bed. By the dim grey light of the winter day, which came meagrely through the one small window, I watched my beloved. He lay there on the cushions, his handsome face drawn and thin, his dear emaciated hands limp on the bed's white cover. I felt an unbelievable, heaven-sent strength which seemed to steady me. "Darling," I began, "dearest one, perhaps God wishes you to leave me." "It is too soon to give up," Enoch whispered. "It would be hard for me to give up the fight, now that I have almost reached my goal. But perhaps, dearest, your fight in the heavenly ranks would be of even more value than it could possibly be here." For a long time he seemed to be asleep. Never for a moment could I take my eyes from his face, praying for fortitude, filling my eyes with the precious sight of him. After a time he roused and spoke. "If it is his will, I am ready to go." He did not open his eyes, but he smiled, and his face was shining. He faced death with the same joy and dauntless courage with which he had always faced life. I knew, as I always did, what was in his mind. He was offering his life now for the redemption of his country. Oh, how I feel the weight of Germany's guilt upon me. "Enoch, darling," I protested, "if there is a man alive who has no part in this guilt, it is you. Did you not just offer your life to God in reparation?" "Yes, I feel this guilt now with awful clarity. Everyone here in Germany has a part in it. Every one of us, even you and I. We have not done enough to fight the evil. We have waited to see how things would turn out." "Sleep, darling," I whispered. "Try to sleep. We shall pray. We shall not give up hope." Dawn came at last. It was the 21st day of December, the shortest day of the year. Very early I lighted the candles on a small Christmas tree which I had brought into the room. By their light, Enoch and I received Holy Communion. A little later, the 4 children came for their father's last blessing. But night had fallen when the dearest of lives ended. At that moment, the dark sick room seemed to be filled with light, and the beloved tranquil face shone with an unearthly radiance. It was as if I had gone with Enoch for a moment through the shadow of death into the glory of eternal light, as if I had given up a part of my own soul and in its stead received a part of his. My deep mortal pain was eased by the supreme happiness of knowing that our union was one of eternal love. For Enoch, this was not the end. For him, this was the beginning of the real life, the beginning of the holy fight for the good, the perfect good for which his brave soul had always longed. I knew now the real beauty of death. For days I was uplifted by this knowledge and the exquisite joy of my supernatural experience. I knew at last that there actually was such a thing as blissful suffering. I thanked God with all my heart that he had given me the grace to have seen with Enoch the glory of eternity. A sleigh drawn by 2 black horses brought Enoch's body home to Gutenberg, up the long road to the castle, through the deep, silent snow. All along the way, the people of the countryside stood with bowed heads, the loyal men of Gutenberg following on foot in the wake of the sleigh. The great door of the castle opened, and a flood of light poured out upon the snow of the courtyard. In the hall of ancestors, 2 candlelit Christmas trees stood, one on each side of the coffin. It was Christmas Eve. All around me I felt the joy of other Christmases. Silent night, holy night. There were no Christmas carols, only the voice of the organ for the midnight mass. When the Te Deum was sung, I raised my voice. Holy God, we praise thy name. I wandered through the rooms in my black dress, feeling as though the house were empty. All the love of my family and devoted servants which surrounded me could not reach my agonized heart. My mother was there, the 4 children, Carl Ludwig and Teresa. Dear Elizabeth Stauenberg stayed a few days, and then, to spare me added suffering which my mother-in-law's presence might cause me, Elizabeth had taken the poor broken-hearted woman to Jettingen. All of Enoch's things spoke so eloquently of the life which he had lived with them. On the table by his bed lay the notebook which he always kept there, filled with his notes in his handwriting. Under the bed was his little dachshund, Putzel, sad and bewildered, and refusing to eat. In the corner were the hunting boots which Enoch had worn on his last walk through the woods. In his study the clock on his desk ticked loudly as I stood before the carving of St. George. It seemed as if Enoch were there beside me, as he had been that first day in Gutenberg. For me the house was empty, but there was one place which held warmth and light, the crypt under the chapel. Above Enoch's bronze coffin was a stone figure of Christ the King. I spent hours in that silent place, trying to adjust my mind to life without my beloved. How privileged I was to have him there with me, near me always, while thousands of weeping widows would never know the graves of their dead. I knew that I would never be alone. Enoch would always be close to me, the warmth of his great soul filling my heart with strength. During the first weeks, I was sustained by the wonderful experience of having shared in the glory of his death. But gradually, as this supernatural joy seemed to recede, I felt that the cross of separation, the empty years which lay ahead, were more than I could bear. My thoughts turned to Therese Neumann. I knew that she was one person who would understand the rare spiritual privilege which I had experienced in Enoch's death, and the utter loneliness and desolation which had followed it. I decided that after Karl Theodor left for the front, I would go to see Therese. Karl Theodor was sent to the Russian front. and it was a parting far more difficult than others. Our great sorrow had brought both of the boys into deeper and closer relationship with me, especially the strong-willed Karl Theodor. The death of his father had softened him, and he was no longer afraid to give expression to the love and warmth of his heart. The experience of witnessing their father's death left an indelible impression on the minds and hearts of all the children. Philip Franz, now head of the family, was given 3 months' leave to take over the supervision of the estates. His father's death had bestowed on him the mantle of manhood. It was astonishing how he reacted to the first problems of responsibility. He had Enoch's same direct line of reasoning. It was reassuring to see how well loved he was by all. The tenants, the employees, the population of the town, they realized that he would be like his father, a wise and just man. In appearance, Philip Franz was the image of Enoch, and filled with the same burning zeal for the right. This son, I knew, would be a great consolation to me, someone upon whom I could lean. The day I reached Konnersreuth, Therese Neumann was out nursing a sick person in the village. Her mother took me to Ressel's room and asked me to wait. This room had taken on the spiritual atmosphere of its owner. Sitting there on the small sofa, I felt myself embraced by the peace which Ressel herself radiates. After a time, she returned. She already knew of the death of my husband. She sat down on the sofa beside me and took my hands in her own, which carried the marks of Christ's suffering. My anguished heart soon was eased in her peaceful, enlightened presence. I did not have to tell her all the things which were in my heart. Her shining eyes under her white kerchief looked out at me with a great intensity of love which seemed to envelop me. Tears of sympathy ran down her face. I felt the burden of my almost unbearable sorrow slowly taken from me, and again I knew that suffering can be filled with intense joy. It is strange that by merely being near the simple peasant girl, so filled with wisdom and clarity of vision, one participates in her life, which is so near to God. Being with Ressel, I understood in an even deeper way that death did not mean parting. Death meant birth to the real life. I understood that it would be wrong for me to cast any shadow on Enoch's happiness by abandoning myself in grief. When I left Konnersreuth, I had peace in my heart and a firm decision of what I was going to do with my life. I understood that I must take up Enoch's fight against evil. I felt very clearly that he had bequeathed that fight to me. I also understood how great was God's plan in allowing Therese Neumann to live in a country which was shaken to its foundation by devils. God had placed this great soul in the heart of our country to counterbalance the evil. Here at last was the actual answer to the profound question of my life. Love against hate, good against evil, the eternal battle of man against diabolical forces. This was a battle to be fought on the plane of prayer and suffering. Enoch's death could be a contribution on this mystical plane. My contribution was to accept my cross and to make my life count in the battle. After that visit, I often went to see Therese Neumann. She learned to know and love my children. She especially loved Philip Franz. "It is a joy for me to be with him," she told me. "Do you know that Franz is almost perfect?" As the years passed, I grew to know that Ressel had the charisma of discernment of the spirits. She was always correct in judging a person's heart and seeing into the human soul.